Universal CityWalk, Los Angeles, spring of 1998. The California evening had cooled just enough to be perfect, the kind of night that reminded visitors why people had been drawn to this slice of paradise for generations. Stars glittered overhead, competing with the neon lights that transformed the outdoor entertainment complex into its own galaxy of color and movement. 20,000 bodies pressed together in the open-air plaza, a space never designed to hold such a crowd, but somehow accommodating them through sheer collective will. The air hummed with anticipation, crackling with an electricity that seemed almost visible, as if the very atmosphere recognized the significance of what was about to happen. This wasn't listed on any official tour schedule. This wasn't announced in music magazines or promoted on radio stations. This was Prince, known then by his unpronounceable symbol and referred to reluctantly as the artist formerly known as Prince, performing a surprise concert that had spread through Los Angeles by whispers, by knowing glances, by the mysterious networks that connected those in the know in the pre-social media era. The crowd stood in perfect stillness, a sea of humanity frozen in collective anticipation. The silence before the storm. Behind the hastily constructed stage, Prince sat alone in a makeshift dressing room that had once been a storage closet. His slender frame was draped in a suit of iridescent purple that caught the light and transformed it, shifting between lavender and midnight with each subtle movement. His eyes, lined with perfect precision, stared into a mirror that reflected back not just his immaculate appearance, but 2 decades of revolutionary artistry. The journey from soft and wet to international icon, from Minneapolis outsider to music royalty. His face betrayed nothing of his thoughts, a skill he had perfected over years of intense public scrutiny. Only those who had known him longest might have recognized the slight tension around his eyes, the barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. Something was different tonight. Something unsettled, the carefully maintained composure that had become as much a part of his persona as his music itself. What Prince didn't know, what no one had dared tell him, was that Rick James was in the crowd. Their history stretched back to the early 80s, a complex tapestry of admiration, competition, and conflict. Both revolutionary black artists who had redefined the boundaries of funk and R&B. Both visionaries who created sounds that had never existed before, both unapologetically sexual in eras that still clung to puritanical public expectations. But the similarities ended there. Where Prince cultivated mystery, Rick James sought spotlight. Where Prince spoke in spiritual and metaphysical terms, Rick James was blunt, profane, direct. Their supposed rivalry had filled music magazine pages for years, though Prince himself rarely acknowledged it, maintaining his characteristic mystique while Rick James gave colorful, often outrageous interviews declaring himself the true king of funk. The truth, as always, was more complex than the public narrative. There had been actual conflict, a disastrous tour in 1980 when Prince had opened for Rick James, only to be so impressive that James had allegedly sabotaged Prince's equipment and cut his set time. There had been undeniable competition, both artists watching each other's moves, studying each other's innovations, pushing themselves further in response. But there had also been moments of genuine connection, of mutual recognition between two artists who understood each other in ways the public never could. By 1998, their paths had diverged significantly. Prince continued his prolific output despite his public battle with Warner Brothers, the label he felt had enslaved him. Rick James had faced legal troubles, health issues, and the music industry's relentless march forward that had left many funk pioneers struggling to maintain relevance in the era of hip-hop ascendancy. Tonight, these 2 complicated histories were about to collide again, though Prince had no idea as he applied one final touch of powder to his immaculate face. When Prince finally emerged onto the stage, the crowd's reaction was physical, a wall of sound, of energy, of devotion that hit with almost tangible force. The opening notes of "Let's Go Crazy" exploded through speakers that seemed too small to contain such sound, and the audience moved as one organism, a single entity united by music. Prince was transcendent from the first moment, his movements so precise they seemed choreographed by some higher power, his voice cutting through the night air with supernatural clarity. 3 songs in, as he transitioned into a slowed-down, stripped-back version of Little Red Corvette, something shifted in the atmosphere. A ripple moved through the crowd, starting near the back and moving forward like a wave. People turned, whispered, pointed. Prince, ever attuned to the slightest change in his audience's energy, noticed immediately. His eyes, still focused on delivering each perfect note, nonetheless scanned the crowd, seeking the source of the disruption. At first, he couldn't see what had caused the shift. The lights were too bright, the crowd too dense. Then, as if by cosmic choreography, a path cleared momentarily, and Prince saw him. Rick James, standing in the middle of the crowd, his signature braids unmistakable, dressed in a red leather outfit that seemed designed specifically to contrast with Prince's purple elegance. Their eyes met across the distance, across years of history, both public and private, across all the words said and unsaid between them. For a split second, so brief that most in the audience missed it entirely, Prince's perfect performance faltered. A single note wavered. His fingers hesitated on the guitar strings. Then, with the discipline that had made him legendary, he recovered, finishing the phrase as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something profound enough that as the final notes of Little Red Corvette faded, Prince did something unprecedented in his meticulously controlled performances. He stopped. He actually stopped the carefully crafted flow of the show. The band, professional to their core, faltered in confusion before finding a holding pattern, a gentle rhythm that could stretch indefinitely while they waited for direction. Prince stepped to the microphone, his face unreadable to most, but those closest to the stage would later swear they saw something like vulnerability flicker across his features. "You know," he said, his voice softer than his stage persona typically allowed, "they say music is about territories, about who owns what sound, what beat." The crowd grew still, confused by this uncharacteristic direct address. But that's never been true. Music isn't about ownership. It's about conversation. As Prince spoke, security personnel had begun to realize that Rick James's presence was causing a stir. They moved toward him, prepared to escort him to a more discreet location or possibly out of the venue entirely. But then Prince's voice cut through again, with a clarity and directness that stopped everyone in their tracks. "Rick," he said, the name dropping into the sudden silence like a stone into still water. "Rick James." The crowd's confusion transformed instantly into shocked excitement. Thousands of heads turned, searching for the funk legend in their midst. "I see you out there," Prince continued. "Why don't you come up here?" What happened next would be recounted differently by everyone who witnessed it. Some would say Rick James hesitated, uncertain if the invitation was genuine or a setup for public humiliation. Others would claim he moved immediately, confident as always in his right to share any stage. The truth, as captured in a handful of grainy video clips that would eventually surface, showed something more nuanced. Rick James stood perfectly still for a moment, his expression hidden behind sunglasses despite the night hour. Then he smiled, that wide, charismatic smile that had made him a star, and began moving toward the stage. The crowd parted automatically, creating a path from where he stood to the stage steps. Security, receiving silent confirmation from Prince's slight nod, helped him navigate the final barriers. When Rick James stepped onto the stage, the audience's reaction was deafening, a roar of disbelief and excitement that seemed to physically shake the temporary structure. Prince stood at the center, watching as his supposed rival crossed the space between them. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two icons taking each other's measure in the most public of spaces. Then Prince did something that would become legendary in music circles. He reached behind him, where an assistant immediately placed in his hands a bass guitar. Not just any bass, but a custom purple instrument that was unmistakably created for Prince himself. He held it out to Rick James, a gesture whose significance wasn't lost on musicians in the audience. Prince, who played virtually every instrument on his albums, who controlled every aspect of his music with legendary precision, was inviting another artist, his alleged rival, to add their voice to his carefully constructed sound. Rick James took the bass with a nod that somehow contained decades of complicated history. He slipped a strap over his shoulder, took a moment to feel the weight of it, to adjust to its unfamiliar dimensions. Then he looked to Prince, a silent question. "What are we playing?" Prince turned to his band and counted them into Fire It Up, one of Rick James's own hits from 1979. The crowd exploded again as recognition spread. This wasn't just any collaboration. This was Prince, known for playing primarily his own vast catalog, performing Rick James's music with Rick James himself. The funk legend grinned and fell into the groove, his fingers finding the bass line he had created nearly 20 years earlier. But rather than simply recreating the original, he began to add flourishes, extensions, new ideas that transformed the familiar into something fresh. Prince matched him note for note, his guitar weaving around the bass lines, the two instruments engaging in a conversation that felt almost verbal in its expressiveness. If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from music history. Moments when rivalry gave way to respect, when competition transformed into collaboration. These glimpses behind the public personas remind us that even between supposed adversaries, there can exist profound artistic recognition and unexpected grace. What happened on that stage over the next 20 minutes defied every expectation. After Fired Up, they transitioned seamlessly into Prince's Controversy, the song whose opening line, "I just can't believe all the things people say," seemed to comment directly on the media-fueled rivalry between the two artists. Rick James adapted instantly, his bass style distinctive yet somehow perfectly complementary to Prince's sound. They moved together as if they had rehearsed for weeks, though everyone present knew this was entirely spontaneous. At one point, during an extended instrumental section, they stood back to back at center stage, playing with a synchronized energy that made it impossible to believe they had ever been anything but musical soulmates. The crowd, initially shocked into relative silence by the unprecedented nature of what they were witnessing, had found their voice again, responding to each musical exchange with growing enthusiasm. Most remarkable was the visible transformation in both men as the impromptu jam session continued. Prince, so often contained and controlled, even at his most explosive performances, displayed a looser, more openly joyful presence. His legendary intensity remained, but alongside it emerged something rarer. A visible pleasure in the act of collaborative creation, in responding to another artist's impulses rather than directing every musical moment. Rick James, whose public persona had often leaned toward the outrageous, showed subtlety and sensitivity in his playing, at times deliberately pulling back to create space for Prince's guitar, at other times providing such a solid foundation that Prince could venture into his most experimental territories, secure in the knowledge that the groove would remain unshakable. Near the end of their unexpected collaboration, during a moment when the band dropped to a whisper and the two icons stood alone in the center of the stage, trading delicate phrases between guitar and bass, Rick James leaned toward Prince's ear and said something. The words weren't picked up by any microphone, weren't shared with the audience then or later. But those closest to the stage saw Prince's reaction, a genuine laugh, not the carefully measured smile he offered in public settings, but an unguarded moment of authentic amusement. Then, as if by unspoken agreement, they launched together into the opening notes of Purple Rain, Prince's anthem. Rick James stepped back slightly, acknowledging without words that this sacred musical territory belonged to his fellow artist. But Prince immediately gestured him forward again, making space at the central microphone. When the chorus arrived, Rick James joined Prince in harmony, their voices blending in ways that highlighted both the similarities and differences in their vocal approaches. The crowd swayed, many openly weeping at the unexpected beauty of the moment. In the front row, a young woman held up her lighter with one hand and clutched her friend's arm with the other, her face wet with tears. Around her, thousands of others experienced similar emotional releases, Not just the usual catharsis that great music provides, but something deeper, a witnessing of reconciliation and mutual respect between two artists whose relationship had been defined publicly by conflict. Something healing was happening on that stage, something that transcended the music itself, and the audience could feel it in their bodies, in their hearts. As Purple Rain reached its final, soaring guitar solo, Rick James removed the bass and held it out to Prince with a ceremonial quality that echoed Prince's earlier gesture. But instead of taking it, Prince shook his head and pointed to the side of the stage, where a roadie hurried out with another instrument, a cherry red bass that had been part of Rick James's iconic look in the early 80s. It had been acquired somehow, perhaps kept on Prince's tour bus as a personal totem, perhaps borrowed hastily from a local collector when Rick James was spotted in the crowd. The symbolism was unmistakable. Prince had not only invited his rival onto his stage, but had prepared for the possibility, had created space for this moment of connection even before he knew it would happen. Rick James accepted the red bass with visible emotion, running his hand along its neck with the tenderness of greeting an old friend. He removed the purple bass and handed it to a waiting crew member, then slipped the red strap over his shoulder. The weight of it, the balance, the very molecules seemed to reconnect him to an earlier version of himself. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling it, then looked up to find Prince watching him with an expression of perfect understanding. No words were exchanged. None were needed. They turned simultaneously back to the audience and launched into an extended, euphoric version of Give It To Me, Baby that had the entire CityWalk crowd jumping in unified ecstasy. When the music finally ended, when the last note had faded into the Los Angeles night, the two men stood center stage, facing each other. Rick James removed the red bass and held it out, clearly intending to return it. Prince shook his head and gently pushed it back toward Rick. "Keep it," he said, his voice just loud enough to be heard by those in the first few rows. "It was always yours anyway." Rick James looked down at the instrument, then back at Prince. For a moment, his trademark bravado fell away completely, revealing something vulnerable and genuine beneath. He nodded once, a gesture containing gratitude, acknowledgement, perhaps even apology for chapters in their shared history. Then, in a movement that would be described later as feeling almost choreographed in its perfection, they embraced. Not the performative hugs of music award shows, not the careful distance of professional courtesy, but a genuine moment of connection between two men who had traveled similar yet distinct paths through the complicated landscape of fame, artistry, and identity. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming, a sound beyond cheering, beyond applause, something primal and unified that seemed to come from a single throat rather than 20,000 individuals. It was the sound of witnessing something authentic in an industry often defined by artifice, something healing in a relationship long characterized by division. As they separated, both men smiling now without reservation, Rick James raised the red bass above his head in a gesture of triumph and gratitude before turning to leave the stage. The audience continued their deafening response as he descended the steps, disappearing into the backstage area with the bass still clutched in his hands, as if he feared someone might change their mind and take it back. Prince watched him go, then turned back to the microphone. The band, having followed the unplanned detour with professional excellence, waited for direction on how to proceed with the remainder of the scheduled set. But Prince, in yet another departure from his meticulously planned performances, seemed to make a spontaneous decision. "Sometimes," he said, his voice soft enough that the crowd hushed to hear him, "life gives you the chance to rewrite your own history." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces turned toward him in rapt attention. "Don't waste those moments. They don't come often." Then he nodded to the band, and they moved into a version of the cross so spiritually charged that multiple audience members would later describe it as a religious experience rather than merely a concert. Backstage, after the final encore, after the lights had come up and the crowd began the slow process of dispersing, Prince's manager approached him cautiously. "That was unexpected," he said, the statement both observation and question. Prince, in the process of removing his stage makeup, met his manager's eyes in the mirror. "No," he replied. It was exactly what needed to happen. Then, after a pause, "Where is he?" His manager explained that Rick James had already left, declining invitations to the after-party, saying only that he had somewhere important to be. Prince nodded, unsurprised. Some connections were too profound, too personal to dilute with casual socialization. What had happened on stage existed in its own space, complete unto itself. In the days that followed, the music press exploded with accounts of the night. "Princes of Funk unite at CityWalk," declared the Los Angeles Times. MTV played the grainy footage captured on early cell phone cameras despite strict no-recording policies. Fans who had been present posted emotional accounts online, describing not just what they had seen, but what they had felt, the palpable sense of witnessing something historic, something healing. When asked about it in a rare interview weeks later, Prince offered only a mysterious smile and said, "Music heals everything eventually." Rick James, for his part, kept the red bass on prominent display in his home studio. When visitors asked about it, he would sometimes share sanitized anecdotes about the night, tales that captured the public performance but protected the private meaning. Other times, he would simply touch the instrument gently and change the subject. Years later, long after both men had left this world far too soon, that night would still be discussed, analyzed, celebrated. Music historians would place it in context. Fans would share increasingly embellished memories. New generations would discover the footage online and marvel at the chemistry between two icons they knew only through recordings and legend. But perhaps the most telling testament came from a sound technician who had been working that night, who had witnessed not just the public performance, but the private moments backstage. Interviewed for a documentary in his 60s, decades after the event, he leaned forward in his chair, eyes bright with remembered wonder. "People always ask if it was planned, if they set it up beforehand," he said. "But that misses the whole point. The magic wasn't that it happened. The magic was that they allowed it to happen. Two artists with so much history, so much reported conflict, choosing in that moment to rise above all of it and just create together. I've worked thousands of concerts since then. Never seen anything like it. Never will again." The red bass would eventually find its way to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, donated after Rick James's death with strict provisions that always be displayed with explanation of its significance. The official placard offers dates, facts, context, but it's the unofficial stories that visitors share with each other as they stand before the display that capture the true meaning. "My dad was there," a young woman tells her friend. He said when they hugged at the end, the whole place went silent for a second, like everyone knew they were seeing something that might never happen again. Next to her, an older man nods. "I was in the back, couldn't see their faces clearly, but I felt it. Everyone did. Something shifting in the universe." And perhaps that's the most accurate description of what happened that night at Universal CityWalk in 1998. Not a simple public reconciliation between rivals, not a calculated career move, but a shift, subtle yet seismic, in what seemed possible. A reminder that even in relationships marked by years of misunderstanding and competition, moments of genuine connection can emerge, unexpected and transformative. That music, at its best, isn't about territories or ownership, but about conversation, sometimes harmonious, sometimes discordant, but always an opportunity for something new to emerge from the meeting of different voices. If this video has touched you, if it has reminded you of music's power to bridge divides and create unexpected moments of beauty, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who understands that our deepest conflicts sometimes contain the seeds of our most meaningful connections, that what appears as rivalry can transform into respect when we have the courage to see each other's humanity. And remember that in a world that often profits from division and conflict, acts of genuine reconciliation become their own kind of revolution. In a quiet corner of the Grammy Museum, away from the more popular exhibits featuring contemporary artists, a small display contains two bass guitars, one purple, one red, positioned as if in conversation with each other. Most visitors pass by with only a glance, drawn instead to the more visually spectacular memorabilia nearby. But occasionally, someone stops, reading the small plaque that explains their significance. These visitors linger, some placing a hand against the glass, as if trying to touch not just the instruments, but the moment they represent. One afternoon, an elderly security guard notices a young musician standing there for nearly an hour, studying the basses with intense concentration. "Powerful story, isn't it?" the guard says, approaching slowly. The young man nods. "I've watched the videos 100 times," he replies. "But I still don't understand how they did it, how they set aside all that history and just played." The security guard smiles, the kind of smile that suggests he knows something others don't. "That's the thing about music," he says quietly. "At its best, it's not about the past or the future, just the eternal now." For a few minutes on that stage, they weren't icons or rivals or anything except two men speaking the same language. He taps the glass gently. That's the real legacy right there, not the instruments themselves. The moment when two people decided that what they could create together was more important than anything that kept them apart.